So before we jump in and I intro our guest Daniel, I just want to do a few housekeeping items. We're going to spend about 60 minutes up here, and then we're going to release you to the bar. At 60 minutes, you can either go to the bar or we have some Q&A. We'll be up here for as long as needed to get through the questions. Just a quick note, for those of you who want to get a drink, the sponsors have all the drink tickets. So go talk to the sponsors and get as many drink tickets as you want. That's our way of kind of supporting the sponsors, making sure that they get people go and talk to them. We couldn't put on the Hint Summit without the sponsors, so thank you so much to them. So I want to just quickly intro Daniel and then we'll jump into the conversation. So Daniel is the founder of the Consilience Project, which is aimed at improving public sense-making and collective intelligence. He's a social philosopher focused on making sense of the state of civilization and how to prevent the many catastrophic risks we currently face with the solutions that are not dystopic. So these are kind of concepts we're going to cover in the conversation. But he sees some of the feedback loops between societal elements and the individual. And so a lot of his work and analysis is actually thinking about the future of healthcare. And I came across Daniel, I sort of went down a little bit of a rabbit hole. I was reading about money and the kind of the role that money and currency plays in economies and just the global system. And kind of came up on these ideas around how modern economies are incentivized to grow forever, basically. And if you tend that to kind of the end of time, eventually you run up against planetary boundaries and cause a bunch of problems. So I found when I came across Daniel that he had one of the clearest sort of thinking about many of the issues that and catastrophic risks that face humanity. And as I'll talk in my talk tomorrow, some of those sort of are related to healthcare. And so I wanted to have Daniel here, both to share kind of some of his thoughts generally, because I think it's really important as a community that we kind of broaden our knowledge base and continue to look outside of our industry, but also because I think he has a lot of really interesting ideas about healthcare. So Daniel, thank you so much for being here with us today. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
So what I'd like to do is I'd like to kind of get to a conversation of kind of some of the structural flaws and your assessment of the healthcare system and also kind of vision of where we could be long term. But before we did that, I wanted just to kind of get some of your big picture thoughts on some of the kind of catastrophic risks that are facing humanity, as well as what you kind of refer to as the meta crisis. And I'd love just to kind of hear you articulate those ideas.
Yeah, I will mostly try to face you so that I'm not squinting in the sunlight. People might think that it's kind of a strange thing at a medical conference largely focused on changing the kind of business model of medicine to be talking about climate change and AI risk and escalation pathways to large-scale war and other environmental risks. I was quite happy to talk more just about future of medicine, but you said you wanted to kind of expose people to this thinking, and obviously, while people here are doctors or various positions in healthcare, they're also citizens and humans on a planet that really is facing these very kind of eminent risks. So I'm happy to go over that. Civilizational collapse, like full-blown civilizational collapse, is actually a topic as old as civilization. We can see pretty easily that the early hominids that we could consider humans, other than Homo sapiens, don't exist anymore. So full-blown extinction of those species happened. Happened for reasons that most people believe Homo sapiens had something to do with. So that's kind of an important point. But then also when you study the history of empire, whether we're talking about the Mayan or the Aztec or the Roman Empire or the Byzantine or Egyptian, it's pretty easy to see that none of them still exist. They all went through civilizational collapse. And there's really good academic research. The canonical work is by Joseph Tainter called The Collapse of Complex Societies that identifies that most of those societies failed or they ended up collapsing after hundreds or thousands of years of thriving from self-induced causes. It wasn't mostly volcanoes and weather events, and it wasn't mostly just that some other empire got more powerful. Oftentimes, even if they fell militarily to another empire, it was an empire or a war smaller than ones they had successfully defeated previously because they had already passed their peak of organizational capacity. And when they were actually in their prime, they started having more internal infighting and corruption that led to institutional decay, worse governance, and then they couldn't handle the issues they had been able to previously handle. Also, many of them failed for environmental overshoot reasons, using up trees and topsoil unrenewably and then not being able to support their populations. So the first thing, we don't think about civilizational collapse very often if it's not the field that people work in, but every previous human civilization did collapse mostly for self-induced causes. So we actually don't know how to make civilizations that don't collapse. That's kind of an interesting point. And then the difference between today and the previous ones is this is the first time we have a truly global civilization. We can't think of a US or a Chinese civilization given that the goods and services that we depend upon take 6-continent supply chains, and pretty much no country can make the things that they depend upon. So there is truly an interconnected global system that is going through the same type of decay situations leading to catastrophic risks that the previous ones did on very short term.
Yeah, maybe just give an example, like for example, putting together a computer, right? What are the requirements for that? And that's no single civilization no single country can actually assemble a modern computer, right? Or almost any other advanced tech that we've got.
Yeah, I mean, I think you just said it. I think this is streaming over the internet, which is obviously satellite and server farm mediated, and if you think about the semiconductor manufacturing and the chip manufacturing and the entire supply chains that make that up, they do take 6 continents to make, they do take many, many countries to make, and so the fundamental infrastructure we take for granted without which we wouldn't be able to keep living is truly globalized. And so that creates fragilities where failures anywhere can create cascading issues everywhere. We saw this recently with a local issue happening in a part of the world called Wuhan, China, and the net results being global impact pretty rapidly, not just in healthcare, but then to try to shut down the spread of the virus. There was shutdowns of supply chains that stopped the flow of fertilizer and pesticides, that created crop failure that damaged the food supply for hundreds of millions of people. The ripple effects of that are still cascading, and many other effects like that. So even though civilizational collapse is a kind of ancient topic, the first time we had a technology where we could induce it quickly at a global scale was World War II and the bomb. The bomb was obviously the first truly existential capacity where humans could make a handful of dumb moves and end habitability writ large for the planet. And that was really a turning point, because the entire history of the world up till that point, anytime we developed a new technology, there was a race to implement it as fast as possible for the competitive advantage. Now we had a technology where we had to make an entire world system that ensured we never used it. And the world system from World War II till now that has kind of prevented a kinetic nuclear World War III, for the most part is ending right about now, and it has driven hundreds of catastrophic risks that are imminent in very short term. I can kind of give a brief overview of that.
Yeah,
that's the meta
please
crisis.
jump in. Yeah.
So to prevent World War III kinetically and between major superpowers, which is a big deal when you look at the whole history of the world. The major empires never didn't war. That was always kind of the defining feature. Now,
when you say kinetic, maybe just kinetic war, just a quick summary.
Actual war with weapons.
Yeah, okay, cool.
As opposed to information wars or narrative wars or economic wars or supply chain wars or other forms of competition. There's obviously a blurry line between politics and warfare.
Yep.
But to prevent, and we've had proxy wars since then, but you couldn't have the major nuclear superpowers go into a full-blown kinetic war. And so there were a few major parts of how we achieved that. One was mutually assured destruction. And mutually assured destruction worked when the only catastrophic weapon was nukes, because nukes are extremely hard to make. Uranium enrichment is difficult. Cyclotrons that make uranium can be seen from space. It's pretty easy to monitor who has them. So you can prevent lots of countries from getting it. And so you can create this kind of forced equilibrium called mutually assured destruction. Obviously, since mutually assured destruction till now, we have not succeeded at nuclear disarmament. We have been in an arms race towards faster and faster nukes, hypersonic nukes, because whoever had the fastest ones could win first strike. More countries have got them, and more other countries are connected to countries that have got them that could influence them with cyber weapons and other things like that.
And then you have the arms race between America trying to build systems to intercept the nukes, and so then the Russians build like Poseidon to go undersea and nuke, so they can nuke things really quickly, and you just have that continual arms race to the point where now we're more nukes than we were when we started with nuclear non-proliferation.
Right. And of course, when you have very good ability for cyber and information attacks that can make it look like the other guy launched and you're in mutually assured destruction, that's a very sketchy scenario.
Right.
We're in that scenario. But it's also important to understand that there are now many, many nuclear level catastrophe weapons, and that unlike nukes are not hard to build. This is something to understand about the biotech is a great example. We obviously just experienced the effect of a pandemic of a not terribly lethal virus. If you look at the rate of development of biotechnology, both synthetic biology plus things like CRISPR, genetic engineering, and how the rate of that advancement is making the genetic engineering capacities to do those things much, much cheaper and more decentralized. We're currently 3 to 5 years away from tabletop CRISPR being pretty inexpensive and ubiquitous, which means the ability to engineer pandemic bioweapons is available to a single person in their basement in a way that's pretty much unmonitorable. And unlike nukes that are very, again, hard to make and control, here all I need is the information of the sequence, right? The DNA or RNA sequence. So if we even have open publishing in science, somebody figures something out at a university with an ethical review board, it gets published. Anyone else who doesn't have the ethical review board who now has access to that information with non-high-tech, with non-hard to create technologies has the ability to produce catastrophic tech. And obviously they can use that intentionally as weapons. They can also use it unintentionally to try to do good stuff but have accidents. Protecting biosecurity is actually amazingly hard. And trying to use a biotechnology for a positive purpose but not being able to factor all the second order effects, right? We started adding lead to gasoline to stop engine knocking. And the effects of all the lead that went into the environment took about 1 billion IQ points off the planet cumulatively before we dealt with the regulation and increased violence about 4x across the population.
And the inventor, the video you shared the other day, the inventor of lead gasoline killed more people than any other human in civilization or something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And so this is an example of you build something for one hopefully positive purpose, but it has lots of other purposes, many of which end up being negative. We call this externalities. The more powerful the tech gets, the faster the externalities are. And obviously, 4 out of 5 doctors chose Camel cigarettes, and DDT was better living through chemistry for everybody, and it wasn't until we saw how many people that killed and how many pollinators it killed that we regulated it. We regulate way after the fact. With things like self-replicating biotechnologies and AIs, we don't get to do that. If we wait till after the fact, it'll be too late. And so coming back, mutually assured destruction works when you have one catastrophe weapon, 2 superpowers that have it. It's really hard to make and easy to monitor. Now we have dozens of catastrophe weapons, many dozens of actors, including non-state actors who can have it, exponentially more actors that are unmonitorable in the very near future. And so oftentimes we talk about how good decentralization and the democratization of everything is, and the way that exponential tech allows what the largest corporations can do to be available to anyone. But the democratization of catastrophic capability is actually not a totally good story. And so if you want to solve the catastrophe weapons for everyone model, how do you do it if you can do it with build the things with non-exotic materials in the basement? Drones are another example. People can take commercial drones and get advanced AI swarming algorithms for free on GitHub. They were developed by the very top thinkers in the world at places like MIT, but then they're free on GitHub. Download them, put very simple kinds of explosives, and take out critical infrastructure targets that can be radically catastrophic. So,
what would be one example of a simple infrastructure target that's rapidly catastrophic?
Better not to talk about.
Okay. Yeah. Good point. Okay.
So, not that hard to figure out if you want to think about it for a while.
Okay. No, but I understand. Good point.
But I will say, if you want to think about another category of catastrophic tech, we apply fairly simple AI models to supply chain optimization. Supply chain optimization seems like a good thing for the environment because it decreases inefficiencies. But if I can use AI to optimize flows through a supply chain, can I reverse it and find what the most critical, the least number of targets that if I were to take out would damage the whole supply chain the most? Sure. Pretty much anything I can optimize with AI, I can reverse. It's the same tech.
Yeah, okay, cool.
And so it's kind of important to get that we'll look at AI for protein folding in medicine to solve some issues, and we'll look at CRISPR and immuno-oncology to try to solve cancer and remove oncogenes. Once you develop that tech for that purpose, you can use it for any other purpose. And you can do a lot of things with CRISPR other than immuno-oncology, and a lot of things with AI in protein folding other than the positive applications.
Yeah, one of the things I found that was a little bit shocking to me when we were chatting a couple of days ago was this idea that we're as close as 3 or 4 years from sort of reaching the event horizon where there's sort of a point of no return of AI sort of reaching escape velocity. That was sort of a little bit of a, in my head I've always thought maybe it's a few decades out. But how do you kind of think about that? Can you maybe provide some examples as to how you come to that conclusion?
Yeah, near-term AI. Let me close the loop on this other thing I was saying about the World War II solution, why it's over. I'll try to be faster. Yep. So mutually assured destruction doesn't work when you have many catastrophe weapons and many non-monitorable actors. The only solution that really anyone is trying to propose to that is, well, if people can develop catastrophe weapons in their basement, we have to know what people are doing in their basement. That requires ubiquitous surveillance. And there are some major nation states working on that. That obviously starts to look, that's a lot of power to be concentrated. It's very hard to have checks and balances on that kind of power. So if you don't want decentralized catastrophic power, then you create some centralized checking force that becomes an unchecked power. So you either have catastrophes on one hand or dystopias on the other. This is roughly what we call the meta-crisis. The meta-crisis is that we don't have climate change risk or AI risk or biotech risk or escalation to war, collapse of supply chains. We have all of them. And that the cumulative effects of industrial tech over a few hundred years, unrenewably removing resources from the planet on one side and polluting on the other, has hit planetary boundaries across many axes. And the evolution of exponential tech has created many catastrophic possibilities. It's easy to benefit one of them while making another one worse. So we can try to sequester more CO2 to address climate change by planting more CO2 sequestering crops in certain areas. But if we do that with nitrogen fertilizers that increase the rate of nitrogen effluent to cause dead zones in the oceans, we can catalyze oceans dying even faster. Most of the solutions, or we say to solve climate change, let's try to create real taxes on carbon to incentivize other energy sources. If every country doesn't agree to it, whichever countries do are so economically disadvantaged in the short term relative to the ones that don't, they kind of lose geopolitically, and as a result you get things like global autocracy dominating. So we have situations where almost each of the catastrophic issues, the simple solutions are totally wrong. They make other catastrophes worse, and the way of approaching all of the catastrophes usually looks like dystopias. So in our work, we're looking for a third attractor, the future of civilization that is neither catastrophic risk or dystopias, which means that it must be civilization systems that can check the power of exponential tech in a global civilization, but have that system have checks and balances on itself. And that's a really non-obvious, tricky thing to do. If we just identify briefly the other couple aspects of the World War II system that drove this thing was the global monetary system that created the reserve currency and all those types of things, the Bretton Woods system. The idea was, let's ensure exponential growth of GDP, because the way you prevent war is by making it to where everybody can have more stuff without taking each other's stuff. Well, how does everybody have more stuff without taking each other's stuff? Well, you have to take it from somewhere. It looks like unrenewably taking it from the environment. And if you try to run an exponential financial system attached to a linear materials economy that destroys the environment on both sides on a finite planet, you hit planetary boundaries pretty quickly.
Yeah, and so just quickly touch on linear materials economy.
Linear materials economy means that we get stuff from somewhere. That looks like taking fish out of the ocean faster than they can replicate, taking trees down faster than they can replicate, taking food out of the soil faster than the topsoil can replicate, taking mining materials out faster than they can be remade. So you get depletion on one side and turning it into pollution and trash on the other faster than it can be processed. So you get environmental issues on both sides. And so obviously with just something like energy, we get climate change and mercury in the atmosphere and a bunch of things from the burning of hydrocarbon on one side, and mountaintop removal, mining, and oil spills and wars over oil and whatever on the other side. It's worth noting that all those issues associated with, say, hydrocarbon energy, and particularly oil-based transportation for internal combustion, that are truly global existential risks, are the unintended consequence of creating automobiles, which was trying to solve a very real problem of transportation and the difficulty of horses. And horse husbandry for drawing carriages, and how nice it would be to have a carriage that didn't require horses. And so we solved that problem, and then the side effects of the way we solved it is global climate change, wars over oil, oil spills, and an entire geopolitical unstable situation. So this is one of the underlying issues, is that we solve problems in very narrow ways that externalize problems that end up being worse. We do this in medicine. And we do this in our healthcare systems to try to make a medical system where whatever kind of piece of regulatory apparatus or incentive is put in place oftentimes causes much worse problems. So one of the underlying things that we need to address is how we define the problems themselves has to be much more interconnected so that we don't externalize problems somewhere else in the process. So obviously we have to also change our global monetary system to not require exponential growth on a linear supply chain, and that's a huge deal. This is not an obvious thing, but we don't have all that long. So basically the solutions to how to prevent nuclear war ended up driving the environmental risks and the growth of the technologies that now portend lots of catastrophic risks. So we have, each year, there are more total catastrophic risks with higher probability. You were asking about AI. Obviously, post-nuclear, we got digital revolution, and computers were kind of the beginning of exponential tech, meaning technology that makes better versions of itself, so you get an exponential curve. And the very center of computation is AI. And so technologies that are on kind of exponential growth curves are the things that can create the biggest effects the quickest. We all see that, like, almost global proliferation of smartphones in just over a decade compared to a couple millennia for global proliferation of a plow, and how radically that changes global behavior and culture and everything.
Yeah, actually, I love your analogy you give with sort of the invention of the plow and how that kind of changed society just profoundly over many generations. Could you just kind of cover that story? Because I think it's a really interesting kind of analog. Or do we not have time for that?
I can do a quick version. I think many people kind of have the sense that either technology is just kind of net good, because technology is trying to solve a problem, and if it didn't solve some problem that enriched human life, it wouldn't proliferate. Markets wouldn't advance it, so the fact that it's solving problems that betters human life in some way means technology is net good. That's kind of certainly the idea that the Industrial Revolution ran on. Then when people start to see, well, the same technology that can get us to the moon is pretty similar to the technology that makes nuclear weapons, and the same computational system that can, or AI system that can do protein folding for cancer stuff can also do it for bioweapons, then it's like, okay, well, technology is not good or bad, it's just this inert thing, and it's the value systems with which we use it that are good or bad. Neither of those are right. Technology affects human value systems inexorably in ways that we have to understand for the design of it. Specifically, technology only catches on if it confers advantage in some way. If using it creates some advantage, which ends up meaning power, which means that if some group uses a technology that confers power and another group doesn't, that other group will probably lose when it comes to an economic war, a political war, a kinetic war. And so the first thing is that any technology that confers a lot of advantage becomes obligate. You use it or you are not part of defining the future. The next thing is that to get the advantage of it, you have to use it, which is a different set of behaviors, and it also obsoletes some previous set of behaviors. So technology changes patterns of human behavior. And doing that means that it also changes the basis of what we're experiencing, like the sensory experience of the world, and as a result, human value systems and cultures. And there's this is such an important topic, because when we're building the tech that is in turn building our minds and we're not thinking about it, you get things like Facebook having this effect of kind of radically destroying democracies and creating polarization or whatever as an unintended effect of like a messaging app. So the plow is a very great example. When the plow was first implemented, a number of things that historians of technology have looked at is that whenever the plow was implemented in an area that didn't have the plow before, they were hunter-gatherers, or they did small-scale horticulture using a kind of human-used digging stick. To go from a digging stick to an ox-drawn or a horse-drawn plow required, obviously, yoking an ox or a horse and then beating it all day long. That was something that hunter-gatherers never did. So pretty much every hunter-gatherer society was animistic. They talked about the spirit of the buffalo, the spirit of the water, the spirit of all those things, so they had some idea of the cycle of life and man's relationship to it. As soon as the plow conferred so much advantage, because it did mean you could create a lot more caloric surplus, which meant that your tribe could make it through famines and grow, which meant whoever used it was going to win over who didn't use it when it came to tribal warfare and making it through famines, you kind of had to rationalize beating an ox all day long. So animism had to go away. There's no spirit of the ox. They're just dumb animals that are here, man's dominion over. So the change of human value systems followed literally a change in tooling. And then things like the plow created massive surplus, where there had not been massive surplus before, because it allowed us to get much more grain product. The massive surplus meant that some people could have a lot more ownership than others, and you started to get radical wealth inequality. You also started to get much faster growth of populations. You also got pretty much the end of female gods in most cultures, because previously, in hunter-gatherer cultures, you had male and female gods associated with the fact that men and women were both supplying foodstuff, or the stuff of life, and involved in that mythos. Obviously, we moved from hunter-gatherer mythos to agrarian mythos, but now men were both doing the hunting and the plowing because the upper body strength needed. And so the thing that is called the patriarchy followed a tool. There's 1,000 more examples of now you have inheritance because of the amount of surplus, and because of inheritance, institutions on marriage change. So literally, like economics, religion, core spiritual ideas, ideals about nature, male, female, all changed with a tool. And so it's a very important topic as we see the exponential rate of technology development, and that it doesn't just produce physical externalities like leaded gasoline having an effect on human brains that made us both dumber and more violent at scale, but it also has these psychosocial effects.
Okay, and so one of the things that we think a lot about at Hint is the sort of this idea that within the healthcare system there's just perverse incentives kind of everywhere, right? And I think one of the things I've found quite interesting is sort of listening to you talk about kind of the alignment and misalignment problem. And maybe just before we sort of parlay into healthcare, can you just share some of your thinking in terms of how you think about the alignment problem and perhaps how it may relate to kind of healthcare?
Yeah, so the term perverse incentive in economics means anytime that some agent, whether it's a country, a company, or a person, somebody in a company, has some incentive to do something that is going to harm some other agent of the commons. So there is a alignment gap between the well-being of everybody and the incentives of everybody. It's very hard to prevent people from doing things that you're simultaneously incentivizing them to do, which also means disincentivizing them not to do. And so we try to create a system of law that prevents people from doing things where they have economic incentive, but it causes enough harm we think is problematic. But then, of course, if there is a aspect of the market that law is preventing from doing a thing that would be profitable, one of the most significant things the market can do to advantage itself is to try to change regulation. And so thus lobbying gets entered, and campaign finance support, and the whole host of incentives that come in, and you get regulatory capture. Perverse incentive is a very deep topic because, you can say, is it possible to have a for-profit military industrial complex as one of the most profitable sectors of the global economy and have enduring peace? If there were solutions for enduring peace that were able to denecessitize most of that would actually collapse the global economy, is there some problem in the incentive landscape? Obviously there is. And we see this with things like the perverse incentive in for-profit prisons. Healthcare has a heap of examples like this. This is one of the reasons why global GDP is not a good measure of the health of the world, because GDP goes up during war and military spending. GDP goes up with more sick people and more healthcare spending. It goes up with addiction and purchasing associated with addiction. So the reason that I responded when you reached out, and the reason that I'm here, is because you said that you were looking at how to address perverse incentive in healthcare, and what you felt like was kind of the central and highest leverage area, and that underneath all of the problems in the meta crisis, there's perverse incentive driving AI to go much faster and less safely than it should, driving biotechnologies to go faster and less safely. And it's not just economic perverse incentive. It can be things like a military perverse incentive, where it's like, it's pretty understandable, hey, they're going to develop this weapon, so we have to develop it first, otherwise we're going to lose. And so because we can't be sure that they aren't going to develop it, we all have to race to develop it as fast as possible, even though most likely we all die from it. So that's a perverse incentive where what is good for me in the short term and what is good for everybody in the long term are exactly opposite. But if I try to do the thing that's good for everybody in the long term, I'll probably lose in the short term.
So I guess, there's a lot of, when I sort of listen to you, I get pretty nervous about our future. So how do you, are you all, so are you, is there, how do we get through this? Like what is it that you're working on, and how do we sort of start to think through the solutions and maybe paint a picture for that?
I didn't answer your short-term AI question.
Oh yeah, let's jump into the short-term AI question. Yes, I'm fascinated. Like, why in 3 years are we in trouble if we don't make some big changes as it relates to AI? And actually, maybe also address how some sectors that are, say, developing AI for a good purpose actually may be partially responsible for the acceleration of the AI that could be used for the wrong reason.
So we could easily read the books about how society is getting better and better, whether we're talking about Pinker or Diamandis or Hans Rosling's work, and heaps of statistics on things that are getting better, and it's true, like nobody wants to go back to a pre-Novocaine world or a pre-antibiotic world, but they cherry pick the stats to focus on the things that are getting better and not the things that are either getting worse or moving closer to catastrophic worse. And other people focus on those, and they're both true simultaneously, and this is kind of a complicated thing to hold. Did antibiotics solve a whole lot of easy mortality? Totally. That's awesome. Did inappropriate and overuse of antibiotics as opposed to a more nuanced approach to the human relationship with the global kind of microorganism community create really nasty antibiotic-resistant bacteria that are increasingly accelerating and effects on the human microbiome that have effects on genetic transcription and all kinds of health issues? That's also true, right? So you might say, hey, you're being a perfectionist, every tech is going to have some costs. We can actually do a better job of identifying all of the interconnected things rather than this kind of single element reductionism, and being able to develop tech that has more positive externalities and less negative externalities. So if we talk about AI, of course AI can be advanced for a very positive purpose, and medicine is one of the very best purposes, and also both AI and biotech are advancing largely for purposes in medicine. Image recognition on medical files, and then big data on medical information for AI pattern recognition to be able to start to identify early disease indicators. Like, that's awesome. Everybody here wants that. But it's those types of applications where the both kind of public support and regulatory support and money going into the development in the for-profit and academic world create the advancement of the technology that can then just so easily be repurposed for any kind of purpose. And so if you want to ask, like, what are some of the near-term risks? If we see the extreme polarization that happened around the fundamental beliefs about COVID, like, did it come from a lab? Did it not come from a lab? Is it even a virus, or is it an exosome? Is it real or is it not real? Should we wear masks or not? Vaccines, hydroxychloroquine, whatever. It was like the most foundational just assessment of base reality had almost completely polarized perceptions on almost everything. And we can look at the media landscape and talk about this, and there were obviously forces driving polarization before the internet, but social media in particular radically accelerated these as a result of a particular type of AI application. So if you haven't watched The Social Dilemma as a documentary that covers this, it's a really good one to watch. The very brief gist is, I can't see all of the news that's out there. It's billions of new pages uploaded to Google every day. And so I go to Facebook or whatever my kind of social media feed is, I'm going to scroll. It's curating from all of the information on the internet a subset of things to put in front of me, and the things that I see end up affecting because I'm not perceiving the world directly, I'm perceiving media, meaning an intermediated world or an intermediated perception of the world. And the AI gathers data about me, gathers data about my mouse hovering patterns, my click patterns, my friend network, and all those types of things, and it empirically optimizes for making me spend the most time on site and engage with the content the most. It happens to be the things that scare me, piss me off, and appeal to my bias make me spend more time on site most of the time than the things that challenge my bias and make me do complex, hard thinking. So it ends up optimizing for clickbaity titles and over certainty and over sanctimony and villainization of the other guy, but it does it for everybody's existing bias set. So whatever your current views are, you're likely to feel more righteous, more certain, more sanctimonious, more villainizing about those things simultaneously. And then this is true for climate change and true for social justice and racial inequality and every possible thing you can get. So this is the opposite of a fourth estate, which was supposed to be a prerequisite of democracy, that we all had the same information to do collective decision making. This is actually making sure that everyone has maximally polarized information. A polarized electorate elects a polarized representative class that creates gridlock that can't do shit, and then when that is in geopolitical competition with China that doesn't have that issue, doesn't have term limits, et cetera, it will just lose at long-term planning.
Right.
And so that's already an example of a simple AI, a content curation AI that is destroying democracy, the social contract, the epistemic commons at scale.
Yeah.
Now,
and just quickly, epistemic commons?
Our ability to collectively make sense of the world we live in.
And the fourth estate? Basically the news.
News.
Yeah, good.
The idea of the US and most modern democracies is that the democratic system depended on two prerequisite institutions, which was public education and an independent news or fourth estate, because you had to have an educated and informed citizenry to do collective choice making. If we didn't all have collective sense making about what's actually going on, collective choice making has no possibility. And the quality of public education and of media relative to the actual problems we face and the complexity means we obviously don't have anything like democracy. We have a simulation of one at best and a rapidly failing version of that. So that's already AI causing catastrophic risk. Now, if you want to talk about the scary scenarios that seem scary, it's things that look like scary things, like autonomous weapons. And if you want to just get a brief sense of what that looks like, go to YouTube, watch a short video called Slaughterbots. And you'll get a brief intro to what swarming autonomous weapons in the very near term look like. This is being radically advanced in an arms race. But faster than that, the Facebook algorithm and the Google algorithm, whatever, are basically curating content that humans made. AI is now also creating content that people can't tell wasn't made by people, meaning it passes the Turing test. GPT-3 is a technology that's already publicly available that I don't need to program. I just speak into it with natural language. I say, GPT-3, make me a argument about why all COVID vaccines are dangerous, using real statistical analysis, real data sets and real statistical analysis that shows that, and it'll
make
instantly
a really great
present
argument,
that.
yeah.
And it can do it at a speed that biostatisticians can't begin to actually address debunking. And I can also say, given your personalized data, make one that will maximally compel you to X. And so the speed at which that technology is becoming ubiquitous is like a 3-year time horizon. So if we can make maximally compelling content of any kind that floods the internet where nobody has the ability to tell what is real or not on anything, then in the inability to make sense of the world, despotic leadership and things like that take over. So that's roughly where I said a irreversibility on a short number of years timeline.
Yeah, so it's not that in 3 years the Terminator shows up, it's just that if we don't figure out how to kind of put in some controls or start to figure out ways to kind of almost like mediate the tech, we will get into a situation where it's almost like irreversible. And so maybe a question for you on that is, how do you sort of tend to think about kind of on the solution side of this equation? Like what is it that, what's driving your thinking? What are the tactical things that we can start to think about now that actually move us towards not being all, in a lot of trouble in, let's say, 3 to 10 years?
So if we think about AI and biotech as two of the categories of exponential tech that are making the fastest rate of change, synthetic bio is actually advancing much faster than Moore's law currently. That means that exponential growth of technology means exponentially more impact, exponentially faster, with exponentially less money and an exponentially smaller number of people involved.
And exponentially dumber people because of social media is making us all, basically go to one extreme.
The complexity of the world is hard to understand already, and being able to appeal to the lower angels of our nature of tribalism and et cetera, as opposed to really try to handle complexity and nuance is an easy thing to do. So underneath the reason that we're letting AI move as fast as it is, and we're letting biotech move as fast as it is despite the risk landscape, is a type of perverse incentive that we call the multipolar trap, meaning you have many different players, many different agents that are all incented to go as fast as possible to the thing that is likely to create the worst case scenario for everyone, because if they don't and someone else does first, they lose in the near term. This is the case with the tragedy of the commons, meaning if I don't go fish all the fish to try to let the fisheries restore, but somebody else is going to, if I can't ensure they're not going to, then me not doing it doesn't leave the fish. The fish are still going to go. It just means that my rival is going to be able to grow his population and economy faster. So not only will I not leave them, I have to race to get him faster than he does. And so this is a multipolar trap in the environment, and that's happening with climate change and dead zones and oceans and all those things. It's the arms race. If I can't ensure that the other guy is not going to develop the weapon, then I have to work to develop the weapon and the counter weapon faster, even though that means increased likelihood of everybody dying from those weapons. And the worst case is actually the market case. Whoever gets first mover advantage will have so much advantage, and specifically in the world of network dynamics, where you'll have one Facebook bigger than all other social media, one Google bigger than all other search, one Amazon bigger than all other online stores. That's mediated by the fact that those networks have something called Metcalfe law. They get much more value as they get more users. So once they get a certain percentage of users, they get a kind of takeaway dynamic where they'll have a natural monopoly. So in a world with natural monopolies because of networks, and in a world with first mover advantage, nobody has the incentive to really think about the risk landscape, go slowly and carefully. Everyone has the advantage to do the famous Silicon Valley adage, move fast and break things. But
you don't want to break things when it's breaking the whole world, basically.
Well, so far, break things has always been able to be socialize the losses. The government will deal with it, the environment, whatever, while privatizing the gains. And that's been the orientation. And if anyone wants to go slow to think about how to do this thing in a non-terrible way, someone else still moves forward fastest and the terrible thing still happens, then even the people who want to be ethical say, fuck, I've got to go as fast as I can to do the thing, so at least I then have the ability to do the right thing later.
Right. Yeah,
so you end up having everybody racing on AI, even who know the issues.
Yeah, I'm a good guy. I'm going to control the AI so I can stop all the bad guys getting AI, and then ultimately you end up with AI taking over everything.
And it's a really hard problem if you're like, okay, we can kind of see if people are making nukes because you can see uranium enrichment from space, but you really can't see that with AI or biotech. So how do I know that the Chinese or the Russians or the whoever aren't doing it in some secret underground military base? Even if we make an international agreement, they agree that they're not. I have to assume they are, and they're lying to us. So we're going to do it as well, and we're going to lie to them, and we're going to, spy on them. And so either we don't make the international agreement at all because everyone knows it's unenforceable, or we all make the international agreement and all break it. And so that multipolar trap, that's a legitimately hard thing. And this is why you start to feel the intractability of it. What can I do, right? So one of the things we obviously have to do that is deeper than climate change or AI or biorisk or anything is solve that kind of underlying issue, right? Solve multipolar traps more categorically. So our research organization and a handful of other organizations are launching a project, the Orienting Questions Project, where we're basically saying more than the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, the things that humanity should orient around as its kind of primary planning and problem solving are these underlying dynamics that give rise to all the problems and catastrophic risks, and basically the questions of how to progressively find better solutions. And the first one we're starting with is progressively better solutions to multipolar traps. And I can give you examples of partial answers. There's a company that we're in conversation with that has the largest private satellite network in the world for imaging They have very high resolution real-time imaging of the entire surface of the world every day. It's getting better and better and moving towards basically like real-time video of the surface of the world.
And who's that company?
Planet Labs. And they're very interested in the application for these types of things. Now, if we see areas of a bunch of plastic in the ocean or dead zones in the ocean, but we have this kind of high quality imaging, can we trace back where it came from to actually be able to identify attribution? And as a result, the transparency, even though, let's say, this country couldn't go monitor the other country because it wouldn't get the permission, the satellites actually don't need permission. They're in international space and they have the allowance to do that. It means anything that is visible on the surface of the Earth can be monitored. And now we have the ability to say, because of transparency, we can actually do a better job of creating and keeping international agreement. Yep. Can we see the movement of military activities and logging and all kinds of things that way, and fishing boats? Yeah. So forced transparency is an example. And you'd say, well, but what about the deep underground military bases?
Well, why don't we transition to an example of a multipolar trap in healthcare and maybe talk about ways to solve that? So I think one example of a multipolar trap is you've got the insurance carriers on one side, and their incentive is to kind of effectively to continue to increase the total cost of care, because their profits are effectively a fixed percentage at scale on top of that. And so their incentive is to kind of deny claims while, where possible, while pushing the cost of healthcare up. On the provider side, in a fee-for-service model, the incentive is to drive as much volume as possible so that you can submit as many claims and drive as much revenue as possible. And you end up in this sort of arms race where both sides, in order to win, both sides need to continue sort of on that game until you end up in a situation not too dissimilar to what we're in today. So would that be an example in healthcare, or did I get the idea of a multipolar trap wrong?
That's not exactly a multipolar trap. The multipolar trap would be more like, say, competing providers or competing pharmaceuticals, where if any of them figure out how to lessen the regulation of clinical trials, then all of them are oriented to do a similar thing. So it's more specific within a domain, but what you're talking about is the same type of thing. It's where you have individual perverse incentives in relationship with each other, creating attractors that are not the global optimum for anybody. And obviously, you're picking this one because you built a business and a conference to address this one in particular, which I think is really cool. Do you want to speak about that?
Well, actually, one of the things I'd like to do is I'd love to kind of maybe jump into how you tend to think about what healthcare could be long term, right? So if we could sort of fast forward to very long term, because I get it. I sort of find that you are quite good at thinking about where we end up very long term. I think if we can get to that, then, and what the world may look like if you sort of tend out, a long way, then we can maybe start talking a little bit about what are things in the short term that could maybe impact that long-term view.
Yeah. So obviously thinking about all of the sectors, future of economics, future of governance, future of defense, future of judicial system, future of medicine and healthcare and education are, part of this type of analysis I've been interested in. I don't know if you can send that interview Z-Dog and I did, because we discussed that quite a bit, and so I won't talk about those parts. I'll talk about some other parts that I think.
Yeah, the Z-Dog interview I thought was really awesome. So I recommend going and listening to it if you found this interesting.
I'll actually give an example of the very positive applications of both AI and biotechnology to the future of medicine, what that portends for the role of the doctor and the GP in primary care in particular, and how I think the direct payer model kind of fits in very nicely. I was thinking about this last night on the way here after you and I talked about the direct payer model. One of the trends that we can see over the next few years and few decades is increasing technological automation of most jobs. Pretty much anything that is proceduralizable, being able to make a robot or an AI that can do better or at least competently enough to displace much of the job, like that thing is happening, will happen. And we can see that in medicine too. We can already see that machines like the Da Vinci are going to replace surgeons for a lot of very technical things. And obviously, the ability to take, like, the evolution of diagnostics to be able to run a lot more biomarkers a lot more cheaply so that you get really kind of big data on an individual. Mass spec is getting cheaper, and home devices like continuous glucose monitoring are getting better and better to become like telemedicine type things. So you take the intersection of those and you get something like really high quality at-home metabolomics, where you can take urine or saliva, run an entire metabolome, and be able to upload that to a cloud. People can't make sense of that, right? Like, the total amount of data is unprocessable. Can big data, both to monitor the individual over time, but also to monitor all people, to notice, oh, all these people who got this kind of cancer had these as the earliest markers way before any cancer indicator we currently had, is a lot of diagnostics going to become the intersection of much better diagnostic technologies plus big data and data processing plus AI, totally. And obviously even things like image recognition on much larger databases than a doctor can hold in their mind. So then the role of the doctor in the future will become largely, what are the things the AI does not do well that are still the things that the doctor does well, and the interface between the patient and the technologies. And so there will still be a role for a surgeon in relationship with the surgical AIs, but it's a different role, right? And the same thing with diagnostics. So I see that a huge part of what the doctor becomes is related to deep human connection, which is the thing the AI is not going to do as well. And being able to really take enough time with the patient and ask enough questions to be able to find out if that thing started after a micro head injury that might have created a subclinical TBI that doesn't show up on a MRI, but maybe would show up on a SPECT scan, or if it happened after some mold in their house that, again, they didn't notice as an acute thing. But all the things that can be delayed causation, chronic causes of things, emotional dynamics, whatever, for the doctor to ask enough questions to really get a sense of those things. You had on your website the example of this doctor who giving the TED Talk.
Yeah, Dr. Rob.
Where,
there he is. Yeah.
Where he had the time to say, hey, if she broke her foot and doing this thing, does she have a bone density issue? As simple a thing as that is to think about, you need a little bit of time to be able to think about your patients to put those things together. So I think the increasing high quality connection relationship with the patient and the specialization things actually will become increasingly automated. I think that is a trend that will probably happen and probably should happen. And so then I really like the idea of a direct payer, starting with primary care model that is increasing the amount of time the doctors and the patients are able to spend together, and trying to emphasize the patient working with a primary care provider that can pay attention to them, track them, care about them more. I think that's very much aligned with some of the key technological advances in the future of medicine.
Yeah, I mean, and so basically, you know, I think there's a, By the way, I didn't tell him to say that, but basically restoring the kind of patient-physician relationship, restoring the integrity of that primary care, almost like the spirit of primary care, restoring that and reconnecting the patient to the doctor as AI comes online, as kind of exponential tech kicks in further and further within healthcare. The last thing that will be automated, maybe never, right? It's hard to tell, right? If we get general intelligence, then anything's impossible. But up until that point, the last thing that will be replaced is that primary care relationship. And actually, if anything, in order to ensure that that is a successful sort of non-dystopic future, right, we need it and basically restore the integrity of that primary care relationship now, such that we kind of can move forward into the future and then leverage these technologies in such a way that makes sense for everyone involved. So I agree.
You know, there's something that I found really inspiring. Several years ago, I was invited to this conference called Heart-Based Medicine, and it was mostly traditional medical doctors there, not like naturopaths and herbalists or whatever, but they were contemplating what the future of medicine should be, that created the doctor-patient healing relationship at the center of medicine if they're going to rethink it. And there were some breakout groups where everyone got to think about what is the future of medicine that they would most like to see happen. And the thing that the most people said, and I was really inspired by this, is that they would like to see hospitals that are more like temples or sacred spaces of some kind, not with a particular denomination, but the idea that this is a space where people are going to die. And this is a space where people are going to be born, and this is a space where people are going to be near death and watch their family members and those experiences and have really hard conversations around you have to make these deep life shifts that involve addiction and your early trauma or you'll die. Like, there's no space that addresses the sacred things of life more potently, and that everything that decreases the potency of that sacred connection should be removed. And I also hold that being as central as the technological and better institutional advances in medicine.
So just to repeat that, so everything that decreases the sacred connection between the healer or the physician and the patient should be removed. Yeah. Yeah. I actually think that would be good, maybe a good opportunity to. Would you be open if we take some Q&A from the audience? Yeah. So we've got some mic runners. For those of you who want to go get a drink, feel free to do so. We're going to stay up here and continue the conversation, and we'd love to have any audience questions. And if you don't have any, I've got a bunch more. So don't worry about that.
Thank you so much. This was incredibly interesting. I found your sort of vision for where healthcare goes next to be quite fascinating. Just the only big question, and I'm sure you think about this question all the time, is how do you marry this world where we have all of this multimodal data on our patients and we're able to use AI with what people in research constantly talk about, which is the curse of dimensionality? And like, what is the role of the physician in helping fight that problem?
Say the last part again. How do you balance
curse of dimensionality? So all this multimodal
Yeah.
data, and does the physician have a role in helping? Because that's at least dogma in the AI world, that there is an oracle that can help with this. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So there's a problem called the info singularity, that we're already in a situation where there is more information relevant to inform most decisions than any human can competently process. And so if you look at how many peer-reviewed published journal articles in any topic there are, no expert can actually keep up with all of them, which means no one is actually an expert in anything. And to try to be an expert in anything, it has to be increasingly narrow domains. Expert meaning knows the extent of human knowledge in that space. And so insofar as there are consequential decisions to make, and there's a lot of relevant info, we don't necessarily want people making it who don't have the info. So the idea there is, okay, we need AIs to make the decision because they can process all of that info. So there are a lot of people who are proposing kind of cybernated systems of governance, AI governance of various kinds, to try to make benevolent, super intelligent AIs that run shit. I think the dystopic scenarios there are almost certain, and that we don't need the AI to make the decision to be a decision-informing system that is able to take all that multidimensional data and process it into something that the human can keep up with. And so it is informing human intelligence and groups of human intelligence, human collective intelligence. This is true for how we make democracy work as well as how we make any specialty profession work, is that I don't want to search on Google or Google Scholar and get websites. I want to see bespoke presentation of the summary of all of the world's information relevant to the particular situation I'm looking at. This is where that same type of AI technology, like GPT-3, that can make compelling deep fakes, can also do this. Like literally today, can already start to do this if we were programming it, where rather than have to look through hundreds of research articles, many of which we'll find out later are wrong, the ability to be able to look at those together, identify where there is information that looks like it is conflicting versus self-reinforcing, be able to give confidence margins, and then be able to give the actual decision-informing meaning, which is usually a second or third derivative of the total amount of data. So it's true that humans cannot keep up with all the information. It's not true that we need to know all the information. We need to know the patterns of the information that are important to informing decisions. And so we can have a symbiotic intelligence of better trained human intelligence with better systems of human collective intelligence, i.e. better than peer review and democracy, systems by which shared intelligence can operate better, which we could get into, augmented by computer intelligence. And so what we're looking for is AIs as decision-informing more than decision-making systems that are able to take that massive dimensionality and show you the patterns.
At the risk of sounding overly pessimistic, that has been the theme. So, do you think that it's too late to develop this model where the sacredness of the healer and the patient can be restored? Because so much damage has been done that the majority of users of healthcare don't put any value on having a relationship, that building a model that would honor that sacredness, that it's too late because too much damage has been done?
Definitely not.
Thank you.
Obviously, when you're trying to pioneer something very different, you're going to appeal to fast adopters first, and the fast adopters might be a tiny percentage of the population. But if the thing is much more effective, then other people who wouldn't have been fast adopters but see it now have an on-ramp into something. So I wouldn't look at population-wide implementation as it's like, before you do scale, you've got to get product market fit, and then you start figuring out the way that scale occurs. You don't need a lot of people. I mean, let's talk about 0.01% of the population engaging in a system of medicine where diseases are being found earlier and being prevented, where they actually feel like their doctor remembers them, cares about them, they want to go, they feel like they are making growth in their own care of themselves as a person by going. And then those people, both because they're getting less diseases and happy or whatever, talking to other people, of course, then brings the next group of people in. And so prototyping, like fundamental prototyping, major changes never happens wide scale first. It happens small enough scale to do proof of concept and then catch on, and it's totally not too late for that.
Yeah, I also agree. I mean, the way I tend to think about it is that you're not going to change a system by trying to change the whole system all at once, right? And I think that's why we started this company, to support this community, because we see that this is the kernel, that's like the seed with which the kind of pearl can form around, and that you can take that and scale that. So I sort of feel like we're still in that, pre-scale mode of making sure that the kernel of what we're doing is sound. But I think we're getting close to the point where enough people are starting to take notice of these types of models that eliminate all of the bad stuff and bring in all the good stuff. I think there's enough people that are seeing this that I think you'll start to see a tipping point, and that's when we can start to think about scale. And so yeah, I'm actually incredibly optimistic about the future as it relates to healthcare. I just think that we need to, keep charging, So, any other questions? So we've got, I think, a gentleman right here. Yeah. And then
up front.
And then we've got one up front. Dino is up front.
Yeah, thank you. Great discussion. Before you got to the discussion of around healthcare.
Can you just put the mic a bit closer?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, great discussion. Before you got to the discussion around healthcare in the current healthcare, you discussed the global, the different issues that are more global in nature. Now, this is really a unique, mostly a US unique to the US that we are discussing about, right? The patient, the healer patient interaction problem. Would you say that it's unique to the US in the context that we are talking about? Or is there or what influence does the global community have in this? With the increasing globalization, increasing interaction among the different societies, do you foresee what influence do you foresee in the improvement of our patient healer interaction?
I don't know countrywide statistics on satisfaction levels patients have with the feeling of care of their doctors, to be able to rank them, and I don't have a clear sense of that. There are obviously pretty significant differences based on the wealth of a country, based on social services available, things like that. But there is also a lot of global standardization, and we saw that so potently during COVID, because of course, let's say that we take a major nation like the United States and it decides that its approach is something like a mandatory vaccine, or at least a requirement of it for travel or things like that. If it decides that, then anyone else that wants to have a travel relationship with the US is now going to have to do a similar thing, which means that even though there was not an international regulatory body, just market type dynamics end up meaning that whoever the leaders are, those processes now become widespread. And that, I think, has been true in many areas of medicine. In terms of this question about the quality of the human contact, I would guess that somewhere like Bhutan probably has a much better version of that. That doesn't mean their system of medicine as a whole is better. In general, I think that's a part of medicine that was often better previously. And while medicine advanced and got better technologically, I think one of the biggest externalities has actually been the patient-doctor healing connection, for all the reasons that you guys know. I think the positive side of this question of the global influence is that if a good enough prototype happens anywhere, I think it does have the ability to influence and scale everywhere.
We've got a question up the front. For Dino, and keep it quick, Dino. No long run-on questions.
You know that's not going to happen. So I don't want to sound
And
like
speak up.
I don't want to sound like a therapeutic nihilist, and I don't know
Sorry,
how
Dino.
to ask this question without sounding like one. But background in clinical epidemiology, so when I look at the numbers, I find a problem with the idea of the social determinants of health.
Social what?
Social determinants of health, which posit that 90% of health outcomes, or maybe well-being or welfare broadly writ, are not related to medical care. Only 10% is related to access to health care, and I would posit 9 of those points are primary care and only 1 from specialty. So the question becomes, do we have a problem with resource allocation, that they're going to this technological and industrial foundation of medical care as it has evolved, and is not focusing on other larger meta-crisis, maybe even meaning crisis kinds of issues that are going to end up being more positive for the rest of us long term?
And maybe actually, Daniel, maybe address the kind of how medicine, one of the questions I'd had, I think it's maybe related to this, is how kind of medicine has to involve addressing other sectors. So I think, like manufacturing and agriculture and things like that. So I think that could be maybe a good combo.
One of the things that Zach was telling me is of the benefits of this particular model you all are working with here is how many more things can be done through telemedicine. because of the financial system. And so I think the ability for things like continuous glucose monitoring and better kind of biometric systems at home and things like metabolomics and image recognition, being able to make preventative medicine and early diagnostic medicine way better, cheaper, more ubiquitous, like I think that's extremely interesting and exciting. And the idea that the primary care physician could have access to those computational diagnostic tools and a telemedicine process, so that things that someone doesn't want to go to the doctor for, but they would actually hop on a quick phone call or FaceTime, and increasingly that the doctor can actually, you can just say, yes, upload my daily metabolomics or glucose monitor or whatever it is here, so that the moment I see a pattern, the doctor can actually reach out to the patient and give them input. What that portends for general health promotion, preventative medicine, I think is amazing. The problem of that everybody's focused on their problem, and they will try, and their problem seems so catastrophic that they'll put all of the resources into that without looking at resource allocation writ large and all of the other problems. Like, that's a governance issue, right? And it is a holisticness of perspective. And so talking about how many of the determinants of health issues are outside of just medicine and access to medicine. So my perception is that the future of medicine and healthcare has to involve the future of civilization design writ large and all the things that end up affecting human health. So when we, like, the lead example is a great example, and obviously we've banned lead in gasoline, except still for piston planes and a few things. But there's something like 50 million chemicals in the chemical database of human-generated chemicals. The VOCs in the paint in here, those same type of petrochemicals can be found in the snow in the top of Mount Everest, and most of them are either endocrine disruptors, neurotoxins, or carcinogens. We can find them in human mother breast milk. Do we need to be designing paint differently with regard to the VOCs involved? Do we need to be doing industrial manufacturing of all things that outgas differently? Totally. If we think about, so I personally think that the topic of subclinical toxicity, subclinical pathogenicity, and subclinical deficiency are huge topics that functional medicine pays attention to, and I think the rest of medicine will start to pay more attention to. Obviously, there's a level of vitamin C that is so low that we would diagnose it as deficient, meaning you have scurvy. But there's a big range between I don't have scurvy and what is the optimal level of vitamin C in a human body. And I think that range, when people are at the lower end of the range, it is still considered you don't have a nutrient deficiency in the formal sense. I think those types of things make a huge difference. So when we look at an agricultural system where you remove all of the trace minerals from the soil, and then you just put back NPK fertilizer, and then continue to remove all the trace minerals, and you see things like very low chromium and vanadium levels in agricultural soils, and then increased type 2 diabetes when chromium and vanadium have key roles in insulin sensitivity, and you see that the decrease in selenium in soils and the increase in heart disease had similar correspondences. Like, and that's just at the level of like topsoil management and agriculture of the productive food stuff, not even getting into, of course, animal husbandry and the way more serious issues there, or then turning it into Hostess or McDonald's. So can I have a world where the economics make commercials for McDonald's and easy access and availability to that starting in childhood, and have optimized health for the whole civilization? Not really. So like the future of the food system and the agricultural system and regulation around that, and the future of manufacturing, I think those are all examples of really critical things to the future of healthcare, to be dealing with the underlying cause of not acute disease, but the onsets of early aging and chronic complex disease. Yeah, I don't know if that addresses the question. Those are a couple thoughts came to mind.
Any other questions? There's one at the one at the back there. Gentleman right at the back.
Happy to talk to you at a break.
Hey, while that mic's been, is that mic working? Can we just have this, we'll have Mark's question, because no, he's going now, okay. Mark, you're next.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you. And speak up nice and loud for us.
Absolutely. So I'm the founder of a healthcare AI company. So after your talk, I'm at least happy that I'm not the founder of a horse-drawn plow company. My question for you is, we're trying to be very intentional about the way we're building what we build. Oversight committees, feedback cycles, but it is difficult. A lot of people, even academics, push us to do more complicated things that aren't easily explainable to clinicians. Have you seen a framework? Have you seen an international policy, international standard that you like that builds in that feedback cycle in an ethical way that's maintainable, so we're not speeding up bad decision making?
No.
Damn.
That doesn't mean that you can't, in knowing that, do various kinds of advocacy to try to help increase that happening. If you want to understand the issues of AI safety and the acceleration of AI causing risks, you can read Superintelligence by Nick Bostrom. It's a good book, but specifically, Yudkowsky just wrote a new article.
Eliezer Yudkowsky? Yep.
Eliezer Yudkowsky is maybe the top AGI risk expert in the world, and just published a new one a couple days ago on the current state of scenarios of AGI risk. I would say it's the best current overview there is. And then what you can see is the various categories of tech development that contribute to those scenarios. I can tell you a few of the things that don't yet exist but need to, and they sound, oh, it's not true. You asked, do I see any countries that are working on it? China is, I would say, from what I can see, paying attention to the existential risks exponential technology portends and trying to find solutions because they have more top-down capability. And so you can see that, like, the social dilemma came out, and we could see everything from teen suicide and body dysmorphia to breakdowns of the family unit to increasing polarization and everything from, you know, January 6th and whatever. We can see all those issues and just no competence at all to do anything about it, because the few tech companies that are doing that also make up most of why our stock market works. Following that, China did something very different, right? They actually made sure that TikTok only showed educational and patriotic material for minors, that there was a limit on the amount of video gaming time. They stopped live streaming. Like, they did massive curtailments of the harmful aspects. Now, this is very concerning to people who think about civil liberties, and doesn't that seem like a very patriarchal, top-down kind of control system? That's true. On the other side, what are the harms of letting it continue? And this is why we say catastrophes and dystopias are the two twin attractors that you have to avoid. But when you look at Ant Group or whatever, the government actually regulating market and general technological development, I would say China is probably doing that better than anyone I can think of, associated with their ability for long-term planning. And we know why we did term limits here, which was to not have, you know, despotic rule long-term. But one of the problems of term limits means nobody ever tries to do anything that has more than a 4-year return horizon, and mostly a 3-year return horizon, which means long-term planning is mostly non-existent, and especially since you know whatever you do will be undone in the next administration. And you just can't do things that have long-term effects without the ability for long-term planning and continue to be a viable civilization, especially in the presence of anybody who can do long-term planning. These are really deep governance changes that have to occur. So one thing I can say that has to change about regulation is, so far, the nature of the relationship between the state and the market in the US has been the market can advance new technologies, bring them to market, pretty unregulated in terms of new things, right? Because it has to work with an existing regulation. And if that thing causes some social harm, then it's up to whatever groups to try to lobby to address that social harm. And then, of course, the for-profit lobbying will work in its own interest, and eventually maybe the social harm will be seen as severe enough that cigarettes won't be allowed to be sold to minors after how many lung cancers or whatever else. Or DDT will finally get banned to then be replaced by another thing that is just as lethal, but we just don't have long-term trials on how bad it is yet, and then we sell it to Mexico and buy the produce back or whatever, things like that. So we have to move to a situation where the new technologies have to actually get regulatory approval before going to market. And we don't like this idea because we don't trust our government, which is why we have to fix that. Because if you say, we don't trust our government, so there shouldn't be one, or fuck, a market does not solve these issues well enough. There are perverse incentives. We do need something like a state and rule of law, so we have to figure out methods for addressing the corruption and trustworthiness, because of course the idea is that the market will do a lot of things well in terms of innovation, distribution of resources in a decentral way, but it also has incentive for a lot of fucked up stuff. And so since we don't want all the trees cut down, we'll make national parks, and we'll have rule of law backed up by a monopoly of violence, which is what the police force is, that will back up nobody logging the national parks. The state is supposed to be what can implement rule of law, which is the collective value systems of the people, right? Which is why you need a educated citizenry that can vote on the jurisprudence, the basis of what becomes law, that monopoly of violence is supposed to support, to check the predatory aspects of the market, allow the productive ones and check the predatory ones. But that only works if the people are checking the state in a of, for, and by the people government system. If the people can no longer check the state because of the complexity of it and because of every topic being a national security issue and things like that, then of course that entire system breaks down, and rather than the state check the market captures the state and the people, whatever. And so there are really fundamental changes that have to occur to that entire apparatus, so that the question of what would it take to create trustworthy institutions, given that climate change is pretty complicated and AI risk is pretty complicated and grid security and medicine are pretty complicated. Individuals can't make all those senses on their own to just like buyer beware be the only answer for everything. So we need institutions that can process that complexity. We have to trust them. Right now there's pretty much no universally trusted institutions. The left-right polarization is so severe and things like that. So the question of what would it take to create trustworthy institutions and a population capable of doing the epistemology and sense-making to determine the trustworthiness of them, it's a big set of topics. We have to do that. There are no answers without doing that are at all competent. And so assuming the ability to make a state that is at all trustworthy, then with new categories of tech that can produce externalities that are truly catastrophic at rapid scale, you cannot release them into the market, wait for the catastrophe, and then regulate afterwards, because it will be too late. You actually have to be able to do the externality assessment up front to be able to ensure that the version of the technology that's going to market is actually okay to go to market. And then you have to ongoingly be monitoring for early indicators it's going in the wrong direction to be able to change that regulation. That is a very, very big change that the speed and potency of exponential tech absolutely requires.
Thank you.
Mark, we had a question from Mark.
Cool. Can you hear me?
No, we can't hear Mark.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
My question for you.
Have you ever been to a conference with no AV issues, Daniel?
Pretty common.
Okay, can you hear me? Great. The question for you is, when I think about healthcare and AI specifically, do you see a tension between the value that it can provide and yet its ability to explain how it got to that value? So I would think that in its most valuable form, when AI is using, going across different information that's out there, it could identify something that it's actually hard to explain in the example of the healer patient to the healer, why this could be the right decision. And if you take it in along that lines, the maximum value from it, it'll be that much harder to explain. And so where is the role there? And if I was just to extend that a little bit, that was a healthcare example. But if you put it in a sphere where time is of the essence, like in defense or something like that, the governance piece that you mentioned, while valuable, it actually seems like it doesn't quite fit, and something else has to be figured out there. Thanks.
I'm sorry, I can only barely hear you. What I'm hearing is, if the AI can identify patterns that they won't be able to explain the causation of, how do we deal with that?
Yeah, how do we deal with that? Because the most value from AI might be when it gets to the point where it can't explain patterns. And then the secondary is, outside of healthcare, that would seem to be exacerbated when speed of decision making based on the results is of essence.
Right. Yeah, there's super tricky issues here. This is where we're talking about the info singularity, that we want to not have the decisions limited to what an individual doctor or a small group of doctors know, because there's some new stuff being published today that none of them read that might be useful, and there's stuff that's published in other languages that none of them have read, and so we want to be able to have access to all that. Simultaneously, we don't want a system that is saying what to do because of what's in a magical black box that nobody can understand. And so what we're interested in pioneering is a kind of symbiotic intelligence between human, individual, and collective intelligence and artificial intelligence. It's neither a artificial intelligence decision-making system, nor is it a purely kind of human-run system. I don't believe we want to disintermediate humans in deciding most things. There's of course cybernated things, like you start, the system notices a particular seismic reading and automatically pulls the train over. There are certain types of things where once we have already engaged in a decision-making process around that's the right thing to do, then it can simply automate that process where speed really matters. But where we're deciding things that have not already been decided, even though speed matters, the accuracy and quality of the decision process really matters, then we want to be able to have the computational systems provide information that the people who are making the decisions maybe didn't have access to, and not just provide information, but provide the processing of that information. Now, on the topic of, but then the people are ultimately still responsible for making the decision. That's where as far as like malpractice and adjudication and all those issues go, the technological system does not actually become the responsible party. The people are the responsible party. Now, the people who are developing and implementing the technological systems have responsibility for the effect of the systems, which is different than the people who are using the system, who still have responsibility for the choices they make. So where the responsibility goes is important. The AIs that can process big data are not that different from the AIs that can also be personalized tutors. So when we talk about the future of healthcare, I think doctors move towards a much more human connection, high-touch orientation. I think this is also very true for the future of education, is that there will be AI tutors that are incredible, and yet we still need human tutors, teachers, interfacing between the kid and the AI, because the AI does not actually have a relationship, a teacherly authority relationship of care and love with the student. So, but let's say, for instance, GPT-3 is already at the place where I can not just say, make me an article that says such and such. I can say, make it in the voice of, this particular author. Give them all of the writing of that author, and it can actually copy the voice of that author. Now, you imagine the deepfake technology of being able to generate animations and videos in real time. And so we already have chatbots where I can talk to the chatbot and it talks back to me that I can't tell isn't a person in many domains. That's getting better very rapidly. That chatbot will move from text chat to a video of somebody I'm talking to. You can go to thisfaceisnotreal.com and see a bunch of faces that look totally real, none of whom are real. They're all AI-generated faces. And some recent studies actually show that that without knowing, not only did the humans not know which ones were AI-generated and real, in general, they trusted the AI-generated ones more, which was interesting. But let's say that I can go into the metaverse, through whatever mechanism, and I can go to the academy and have a conversation with Socrates. And it has all of Socrates' thinking and biographical information programmed in. So I have a chatbot of Socrates that is trying to answer in ways that are logically and semantically congruent with the answers he would have given. Or anybody, right? I could go and ask von Neumann and Kurt Gödel and Einstein to all sit around a table with me and talk about formal logic. That will happen. And that's so mind-blowingly amazing for the future of education that every kid could get something where the AI is actually personalizing, modeling their theory of mind, so not only communicating in English versus Mandarin, but at their level of education. So it is doing personalized transmedia, bespoke education for them based on their questions of this type. Like, that's amazing, but it's also super dangerous because that von Neumann or that Socrates is going to say stuff that is not exactly what the actual one probably would have said. And there's a difference between the type of intelligence that is creating that symbol manipulation AI and the type of intelligence that we have. So now imagine the role of the teacher in the future, understanding those AIs well and understanding the topics and understanding pedagogy. So the student just went in and had this conversation with von Neumann on formal logic, and then I'm talking with the student saying, what do you think the AI von Neumann said that is different than what the actual von Neumann might have said, and why? Based on what is the difference between how this artificial intelligence system works and how you think human organic intelligence works. Now, of course, not only does the kid have that amazing kind of AI tutoring capability, but it also then gets to think about the difference between different types of intelligence and different types of theory of mind. And when that happens, the recursion, when you start thinking about intelligence recursively, intelligence has a kind of exponential growth curve. So what this portends for the future of human learning and intelligence is so amazing. So imagine now that you have that kind of tutoring ability also in medicine, where that AI that identified a causal relationship that it can't show you very easily just from the way that it learned it, because it learned it through some very complex topological assessment. It can translate into a set of causal mechanisms that you can understand. And so we're looking at both, in this situation, the AI being a pattern identifying tool as well as an educational tool.
So we've actually come to time, so thank you all for sticking around with us and asking questions, and thank you, Daniel, and I really hope my next conversation with you isn't with a deep fake. So thank you so much for being with us.
It was fun to be here. Thank you.